is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. America's top diplomat says China is the biggest challenge to the international order as he lays out Washington's policy towards Beijing.
Our other headlines: the African Union urges Russia to stop blocking Ukraine's ports, but Vladimir Putin blames the West for causing a global food crisis.
Easing the squeeze, Britain's finance minister will tax oil and gas companies to help families struggling to meet soaring energy bills.
The high inflation we are experiencing now is causing acute distress for the people of this country.
And art, architecture and automobiles. Why British architect Sir Norman Foster is the driving force behind this car exhibition in Spain.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is outlining Washington's policy towards China. It comes days after Joe Biden's first presidential trip to Asia, where he said the United States would defend Taiwan if it were attacked.
The White House later appeared to backtrack, saying there had been no change on American policy. Well, let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. John, what's US Secretary of State Antony Blinken been saying?
Well, Jamie and Robin, I think it's important to understand that this speech was supposed to have been delivered before President Biden went to the ROK, Republic of Korea, and Japan last week, but it had to be postponed because he was tested positive for COVID-19. So they moved it to today at the Asia Society at the George Washington University, which is a university right in the center of Washington, D.C. And the main thrust of what Mr. Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, had to say was that the U.S. administration under Joe Biden feels that China is intent on reshaping the international order. And Secretary of State Blinken made the point that China today is a very different place from the China visited by President Nixon on that historic occasion in the early 1970s. And the reason, said, if that's to do, China is the only country in the world that has the diplomatic power, the military power, and also the technology power to do so. And Secretary of State Blinken went on to say that he thinks that Beijing is undermining international institutions, laws, and norms, all of which have helped it reach the level it's at today, which is the world's second largest economy, with ambitions to go on and be the world's leading country. Now, in that light, Secretary of State Blinken said that U.S. foreign policy in future will reshape its strategic environment around Beijing. And what he means by that is that the Biden administration is now going to prioritize China in all things diplomatic and foreign relations in all areas of the U.S. administration. So all governmental areas, China moves to the top of the agenda, particularly when it comes to overseas considerations. Secretary of State Blinken says that President Biden believes that the next decade, the next 10 years, is going to be vital in this so-called reshaping of the strategic environment regarding Beijing. And Blinken said that Beijing is a test for diplomacy like nothing we've seen before. Here's more of what he had to say.
Even as President Putin's war continues, we will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years.
Well, Secretary of State Blinken went on to say that the U.S. intends to compete with confidence when it comes to China, but also to contest where we must. And for that, they have three strategic aims, and they are the following. Number one, to invest at home in the United States in all areas, and that's diplomatic, business, governmental, all that sort of thing. Number two, to bolster the allies, and that's what the trip to the ROK and to Japan last week by President Biden was all about. And thirdly, in order to compete with China, economically especially, and also militarily. And the competing with China economically plays into the anti-China competition bill, which is working its way through Capitol Hill at the moment. It's stuck there at the moment, but this is intended to try and compete head-on with China, particularly, you know, when it comes to Belt and Road in regions like, for example, the continent of Africa. Guys?
John, just a thought on the wider context. What's the background to all of this?
Well, Jamie and Robin, this comes after months and months of interdepartmental discussion and negotiation about what China is in the next 10 years, what the threat as seen from Washington is from Beijing, and how they should handle it in this administration. And because of the time lag in these things, future administrations quite possibly as well. And of course, it comes amid persistent tensions. You saw the meeting in Alaska just after Joe Biden came into the White House, which descended into a slanging match between both sides. You've got the delisting of U.S. companies at the stock exchange, or Chinese companies that trade here. Some of that is forced, some of it is voluntary by those companies. There's the anti-China competition bill I just touched on just now, and disinvestment. Lots of American corporations and individuals are banned from investing in Chinese corporations, and that list was expanded under President Biden, when I think many people had assumed that it might actually be reduced. Now, a couple of things, of specific things that Secretary of State Blinken said, just quickly on climate change. Of course he said, we must all do more to avoid catastrophe. And that was a hint to the fact that both sides know that they have to work together going forward in the future. And crucially on Taiwan, he said the U.S. remains committed to the one China policy, and he accused China of coercion and provocative rhetoric in actions when it comes to Taiwan. And as you know, Biden was in Asia last week in the APAC region and was asked very directly, would the United States go to Taiwan's aid? Should there be any kind of attack by Beijing on Taiwan? He answered yes, and that really angered Beijing to the point that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a long statement and a long speech before Blinken even got to his feet to try and preempt some of what he had to say. Finally, they're going to create, according to Secretary of State Blinken, a China House in the State Department. Now, what this means is they're going to basically create a new department there, which they refer to as the China House, that will bring all areas of U.S. administration and governmental issues together on one house, the better to understand China going forward into the future. And finally, Blinken said that we do not seek conflict, we do not seek a new Cold War. We have profound differences with the Communist Party of China, but not the people of China. Robin and Jamie?
John, thanks for that. Our correspondent, John Terrett in New York.
Well, Victor Gao is Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalisation. Victor, welcome to the programme. So this speech, this policy, it really is diplomacy without the diplomacy, isn't it? Now everybody knows where they stand.
Now, Secretary Blinken's China policy is starting on the wrong foot. It's a complete misunderstanding of China. It's a complete mislabeling of China. It's a complete distortion of what China stands for. China is a major force for peace and development. China's past track record over the past 44 years demonstrates that China has completely transformed itself and has made the world better. And the United States need to come to terms with a rising China rather than scheming to confront China or to scheming to hold China. What the United States conspire to do will be doomed to failure. They will be living with the steady rise of China, and this is the megatrend of our time.
So what message do you think that the United States is sending to Beijing with this speech?
I think this will make China more self-reliant. It will further strengthen China's determination to strike out on its own, and it will further determine Chinese mind that the United States is out there to derail China. After all, to deprive the Chinese nation of 1.4 billion people of their fundamental right of development may be the largest crime against humanity. Secretary Blinken has the gut to say that the United States government wants to protect the people, save the people from being dying by gunshots, Save those 19 innocent kids whose lives were taken away. Stop the gun violence. Stop the violence against the Afro-Americans. The United States has a full plate to deal with at home. The worst enemy is not outside of the United States. The worst enemy is inside the United States. And I think if you want to compete with China economically, be my guest. The world is an open playground for whatever country to do their best economically. But if the United States want to stir up a Cold War or a hot war, then they need to be prepared that they will be dealt with in a similar way.
They specifically said they didn't want to see a new Cold War. What would the Chinese leadership have preferred to have heard from America?
No, I think if you put everything together in Blinken's speech, then your logical conclusion is that they are preparing for a Cold War, or even a hot war. And the world does not need a Cold War. The world, mankind, do not need a hot war. Let's calm down. Let the United States come to terms with the rise of China. After all, China is not an enemy of the United States. The Chinese people, based on their own courage and hardworking spirit, etc., they are making changes unprecedented in the world. This is not for the worse. This is for the better of mankind. The United States will be surpassed as the largest economy in a matter of less than 10 years. So don't lose the sanity of the U.S. decision makers in Washington. They will live to see the time when the United States will be smaller as an economy than the Chinese economy. So this is the world we are living in. Whatever the U.S. decision makers want to do, they will not change the megatrend that China is on the rise. No country in the world can stop China's peaceful rise.
Victor Gao from the Centre for China and Globalisation, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Ukraine says Russia is stepping up its attacks in the east of the country, shelling more than 40 towns across the Donetsk region. Russian troops there are trying to encircle 2 strategic cities.
Kyiv says at least 5 civilians have been killed in the latest offensive against Severodonetsk, a railway line in the Ukrainian-controlled town of Pokrovsk, which has become a hub for supplies and civilian evacuations, has also been destroyed.
Well, let's talk to the Associated Press correspondent Philip Crowther in Lviv. Philip, are we any closer to knowing if these 2 towns are indeed falling to Russian control?
Well, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister today says that the fighting there has reached its maximum intensity, also saying this, that the enemy, Russia that is storming the positions of our troops simultaneously in several directions. Now, the area that we're looking at here precisely is the Luhansk region of that Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. The governor of Luhansk, the Ukrainian governor of that region, has now upped the percentage of that region that he says is controlled by Russian troops from 90 to 95%. The outlying towns that you just mentioned, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk as well, those are cities that Russia wants to get under its control as quickly as possible. Now, Ukraine says it again and again, in order to be able to hold back those Russian troops and maybe even win this war, not just in eastern Ukraine, but in the whole of this country, it needs more heavy weapons. That refrain from the Ukrainian government coming up again over the last few days as fighting intensifies in the Donbas region. There are other points of view as to how this war could come to an end. One comes from former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. He mentioned this in Davos during the World Economic Forum, mentioning that he believes that Ukraine might have to cede some of its territory. That has been ridiculed here by many Ukrainians, and that includes the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in his address to the Ukrainian people last night.
And behind all these geopolitical speculations are those who advise Ukraine to give something away to Russia. Great geopoliticians are always willing to see ordinary people, ordinary Ukrainians, millions of those who are living in the territory they propose exchanging for an illusion of peace. We always must think of the people and remember that values are not just words.
Philip, 2 more Russian soldiers have pleaded guilty to war crimes in Ukraine.
Yeah, and this is happening in the northeastern Ukrainian town of Kotelvar. 2 Russian soldiers were in court today. They are Alexander Ivanov and Alexander Borbikhin. They are 2 Russian soldiers who are charged of shelling civilian infrastructure with multiple rocket launchers. Now, they have pleaded guilty to those charges, meaning that the maximum time that they might spend in prison is 12 years. Their defense attorney has asked for 8, and remember, this is only the 2nd war crimes trial to happen here in Ukraine since the start of Russia's invasion. The first one led to life in prison for a 21-year-old soldier who killed 1 civilian. This was at the start of Russia's invasion, of Ukraine.
Philip, thanks for that. Philip Crowther from the Associated Press in Lviv.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin has blamed the West for a growing food crisis arising from his invasion of Ukraine.
The African Union is calling for a blockade on Ukraine's southern ports to be lifted. African leaders say the freeze on grain exports risks causing a disaster for their continent.
Well, our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow, and a reminder that journalists in Russia are working under media laws that restrict what they can report. So, Stuart, President Putin speaking at an economic conference of former Soviet states. What's he been saying?
Yes, this group of 5 states is likely to become even more important, he says, that their economic relationship has a special meaning in the context of the Western sanctions against Russia, particularly when it comes to something called import substitution, the use of third countries to take goods which are being imported from abroad, not necessarily with the manufacturer or brand's consent, but via third-party countries to avoid restrictions. That's something Russia is engaging in and has been since the so-called special military operation meant sanctions were imposed on Russia. But the president was optimistic about the future. He said that the economy of Russia will not be squeezed out from the world and that there are positives of Western brands leaving the country with, he said, Russian brands taking their place. This is what he said to a meeting of ministers earlier in the day online.
Of course, we understand the huge technological advantages, the advantages of high technology in developed economies. It goes without saying. We're not going to cut ourselves off from it. They want to squeeze us out a little, but in the modern world this is simply unrealistic. It's impossible. If we don't separate ourselves with some kind of a wall, then no one will be able to separate such a country as Russia.
Now, on this blockade, the Russian President Vladimir Putin hasn't admitted that Russia is engaging in a blockade. The Kremlin says it's not. But in a phone call with the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, he said that Russia was interested in helping contribute to the food shortages in return for Western sanctions relief, particularly on the economy. Russia says it's Ukraine's problem because it has mined the Black Sea and also is the one refusing access to its ports. We know the Russian Foreign Ministry is in talks with the United Nations about how to get more food exported and fertilizer exported from the Black Sea. And on Wednesday, there was a proposal by the Ministry of Defense here in Russia to create so-called humanitarian corridors or safe passage through the Black Sea to try and make a dent in these rising food prices.
And Stuart, also signs of a new clampdown on foreign media in Russia.
That's right. The latest sign from the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, she says that her weekly briefings that have been published on YouTube as well as other places, but she's concerned with YouTube, have been blocked by Google, that they are no longer broadcasting them. And if the next one next week is blocked, there will be repercussions. Notably, she said, either a Western journalist will lose their accreditation or an American media organization will be prevented from working in Moscow. And this comes as many other recent developments for media workers in Russia. Firstly, a new piece of legislation means that prosecutors in Russia can shut down any media organization which comes from a country deemed unfriendly to Russian media. And also a separate piece of legislation that means that particular action could be taken against English language media that have been unfriendly, as it's called, to Russia. So that's on top of already the domestic restrictions that prevent talking about anything other related to the special military operation than anything from unofficial sources, and also many international and domestic outlets have been closed down by the government.
Stuart, thanks very much. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
The head of the World Bank has warned we're facing a global recession. David Malpass says the rising price of food, fertilizer and energy caused by lockdowns in China and Russia's war in Ukraine could be a tipping point. Last month, the World Bank cut its global economic growth forecast for this year by almost a full percentage point to 3.2%.
The UK government is investigating French billionaire Patrick Drahi's increased stake in BT. The telecom group says this relates to national security concerns. Drahi increased his stake in BT from 12% to 18% in December. The Business Secretary will now use new powers under the National Security and Investment Act.
Apple is increasing pay for its United States staff as it reacts to the tight labour market and increasing inflation. Hourly wages will rise to at least $22, up 45% from 2018 levels. The company says it plans to increase pay for workers outside the United States, but has not said when or by how much.
China's search engine giant Baidu has posted a surprise rise in revenue after diversifying into areas like cloud computing and autonomous driving. That helped the group offset weak advertising sales in its home market. Baidu reported a first-quarter net loss of $131 million, with business hit by the economic downturn and pandemic lockdowns.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, more members of Parliament call on Prime Minister Boris Johnson to resign following the official report into those illegal lockdown parties.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
The UK government has announced a 25% windfall tax on the profits of oil and gas producers and a $19 billion package of support for those struggling to pay soaring bills. Well, our correspondent Guy Henderson is in Westminster. So, Guy, this really is a U-turn for Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his finance minister, isn't it? Because this is the policy that the opposition Labour Party was suggesting weeks ago.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Let's just outline what this package of support is first. So, millions of people who've been struggling with the rising cost of living in the UK are now going to receive 2 direct payments into their bank accounts between now and the autumn. And then what had been a loan designed to help people pay their energy bills is going to be doubled, and it's going to be turned into a grant, which means people aren't now going to have to pay that back at all. The government had been under huge pressure since the Chancellor had made a spring statement announcing support which many of his critics had described as being insufficient, given the gravity of the situation. We've got soaring inflation, and as we witnessed here in London this week, got increasing numbers of people who are now having to rely on donations just to be able to get hold of a proper meal.
At this food bank distribution centre in the South London borough of Southwark, supply is keeping up with demand. Deliveries, many of them donated, are pouring in daily to a warehouse that more than doubled in size in the early days of the COVID pandemic. Now, a mixture of full-time staff and volunteers are once again stepping up in an emergency, this time to help those who can no longer afford to buy their own food. Chris Price oversees operations here. The charity he runs helps lift people out of poverty.
So we're trying to make sure people get enough food for 3 days and to get 3 meals a day out of that.
Now nearly 10,000 locals need food packages, up to 30% more than in the middle of last year. Many have to keep coming back.
We see people for a short period of time. We support them to come out of that crisis. So we look at things like helping them with debt management, looking towards if there's any employment that's viable for them, and looking at benefits as well. And people are getting all that support. Everything is in place. And what's happening is they do not have enough money to get by. So they are in a long-term crisis rather than a short-term crisis of not having enough income. And that's getting worse.
That fits a startling national pattern.
To give you an idea of how rapidly the situation is deteriorating in the UK at the moment, a study conducted in April by a think tank called the Food Foundation found that 7.3 million adults were food insecure. In January, it was 4.7 million, so that's about a 60% rise in just 3 months. Since then, of course, costs have continued to rise sharply.
Short-term lockdown and Brexit-related supply disruptions have turned into a longer war and resulting sanctions-induced crunch, with no obvious end in sight. British lawmakers have been furiously debating what to do about it. Opposition parties accuse the government of responding too slowly.
He just doesn't get it, does he? He doesn't actually understand what working families are going through in this country.
Fast forward a few weeks and the Treasury has now bent to the mounting pressure, announcing billions of pounds in extra support, which will be paid for by taxing energy sector profits.
The oil and gas sector is making extraordinary profits, not as the result of recent changes to risk-taking or innovation or efficiency, but as the result of surging global commodity prices, driven in part by Russia's war.
That will help cushion the blow for many of the most vulnerable, who've been increasingly relying on people like Chris and his team's generosity. But this cost of living crisis stretches right through the economy, pushing millions closer to the breadline.
Well, as I mentioned there, the way that the Treasury wants to fund that extra support is by taxing oil and gas companies on their profits at a rate of 25% on a temporary basis. So the idea is that tax will be phased out as prices came down again, and also companies that reinvest those profits will be exempt from most of those tax payments. That is a way to try and make sure that companies keep putting money into the transition towards a greener economy.
But inflation, of course, is really soaring. Will this package really do enough to help with those rising bills?
Well, perhaps predictably, the opposition Labour Party were quick to point out, A, that they've been calling for this tax for months, and so they say that this should have come sooner. And secondly, they say this was politically timed because it is barely 24 hours since a full report was released, an investigation into lockdown parties during a time in which there were still COVID restrictions and such gatherings were banned. But the Chancellor himself did also say this won't entirely address the problem, and he said that most of the forces driving this were global. He said the Bank of England was going to play an important part in trying to keep inflation down by raising interest rates. And he also talked about the British government addressing or trying to address supply side constraints. I think what he primarily means by that is that customs border in the Irish Sea created by the Brexit deal. That's a dilemma because that creates trade frictions, but by potentially threatening to unilaterally withdraw and get rid of that border, well, that potentially sparks a trade war with the EU, which itself would drive up the cost of goods.
Guy Henderson in Westminster, thanks very much.
Carl Thompson is an economist from the Centre for Economics and Business Research, an independent economics consultancy based in the UK. Carl, welcome. Do you think this goes far enough?
I'd agree with you. I think if we rewind a day ago, we were thinking about new policies, perhaps in the region of up to £10 billion, and then they came forward with a package much larger, £15 billion. So this is really quite significant, and especially from a Conservative government. It makes up for quite a lot of the shortcomings of their previous policy announcements earlier in the year. But as the Chancellor said, this will not go far enough. It won't go fully. It won't fully help everyone, and that is not really something that policy could really solve right now in terms of the cost rises that we are seeing.
OK, well, let's break it down a bit. To be blunt, who's eligible for what?
So the biggest component of this support to £9 billion is going to the most vulnerable in society. And I think that is what is being praised the most about these new spending commitments. So there's £650 that is being given to recipients of state benefits, whether that's universal credit or other legacy benefits. There's also a payment of £150 for those with disabilities in September, and then also payments for pensioners of an extra £300 in November and December. Alongside that, sorry.
Apologies. I wanted to ask you about the criticism from some who are saying this intervention will be inflationary. The IFS, the respected think tank, suggesting that putting tens of billions of pounds into the economy at a time of high inflation could stoke additional demand and make inflation much more permanent in the UK economy. Is that not fair criticism?
I think there's definitely something to that argument. On the other side, on the other hand, the majority of this spending is going to those who need it most, the most vulnerable in society, on the lowest incomes. And the argument that spending by them will be fueling inflation in the overall economy, I think, is a little bit less strong, because their spending at the moment is often just in order to pay the bills and put food on the table. Whereas if more of this spending had gone to higher income households, the risk to inflation would be larger. But it's definitely something the Bank of England will be watching in terms of the extra policy that's handed £400, that will hand £400 to all households in October.
It's the kind of economics you expect from the Labour Party, from the opposition party, isn't it? But many members of the Conservative Party, I guess, might be unhappy to see their government intervening in perhaps a free market. This isn't business as usual for a Conservative government, is it?
It's definitely not. And it comes off the back of 2 years of extraordinary spending by the Conservative Treasury and government. Rishi Sunak, you might have noticed in his announcement, likes to stress the fact that he's a tax-cutting chancellor, but that is simply not the case when you look at the numbers. The tax increases that we have seen and are going to see are really quite extraordinary, especially for a Conservative government.
And once you've signed up to this principle, I guess that many people will suggest that there's a global food crisis round the corner. I mean, how about a windfall tax on all of those rich supermarkets?
I'm open to considering that idea. I think if you look at the oil and gas companies, this is really, really quite significant, the profits that they're making. And the big U-turn that's been made here on windfall tax is technically designed in order to ease some investment out of these companies. So I think how the windfall tax has been designed in the end might, well, according to the Treasury, is actually going to increase investment. But we'll wait to see how that pans out.
Carl Thompson in London, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
A number of Conservative MPs have withdrawn their support for Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson as the fallout from illegal lockdown parties in Downing Street continues.
The official report into so-called Partygate found a culture of late-night partying, disrespect towards cleaning and security staff, and staff messages expressing relief that they got away with law-breaking.
Well, our correspondent Andrew Wilson has been following the story. So, Andrew, what are members of Boris Johnson's Conservative Party saying today?
Well, everyone knows that Boris Johnson is part politician, part celebrity, and members of his party have always had this dilemma to take up the electoral asset of having someone who is consistently famous, who is consistently sought after by the media, is popular for his appearances, and also to have concerns about the high-risk nature of his personality and the events that he gets up to. Now, this report, the Sue Gray report, with its talk of drinking until the early hours, reports of fights after parties, of staff having confrontations with members of staff in Downing Street because of the parties, all that seemed to be the cue for Tory MPs to turn their back on the Prime Minister. Well, there's been 3 recently who've done that. The total number comes up to something like 17 in the last 5 months. And it's simply not enough. Now, pollsters are predicting now that the Prime Minister's stock in the public opinion is starting to fall. Now, there's no elections coming up for the next couple of years at least, but nonetheless, pollsters are saying should the government go to the polls in a national election right now, then Boris Johnson probably wouldn't be able to form the majority he has now. MPs are going home for a short summer break this weekend. They may pick up from their constituencies that people are more horrified than they think about Boris Johnson's record as far as this report's concerned, and they may start to change their minds. It will rumble on, but the initial impact from this report has been less than dramatic in terms of Tory membership reaction.
And Andrew, London's Metropolitan Police have been defending how they handled the criminal investigation into what happened.
One thing that did draw attention, public opinion was certainly alerted after the Metropolitan Police report, was that although 120 fines, or just a few more than that, were given out to about 80 people, the Prime Minister only got 1. And yet, in the Sue Gray report, there is a photograph of the Prime Minister holding a glass, addressing a group of people, and there's bottles of wine and bottles of spirits on the table. And people are questioning the police about why the Prime Minister wasn't fined for their party when others there were fined. Now, Sir Stephen House, who's acting as head of the Met Police at the moment, was facing a local assembly, a London committee looking into policing in the capital, and they asked some fairly tough questions about whether or not the police had not been influenced by the Prime Minister in any way, or his people in any way, and they said absolutely not. He said, we do not shy away from issuing fixed penalty notices when we think it is deserved. But they said that they went through hours of photographs, of door logs, of emails, of WhatsApp messages, of questionnaires, of CCTV to establish exactly how long people were at parties, what kind of parties took place, how they developed over the course of the evening. And the police are sticking to their guns and saying, as far as they're concerned, the people who got the fines deserved them, and the people who didn't get the fines did not deserve them. At least they thought they wouldn't be able to, had they had to take them to court, for example, they wouldn't have got a guilty verdict on those fines. And so that's how they're explaining themselves.
Andrew, thanks very much. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson.
Pakistan's ousted Prime Minister is pressing the government to hold fresh elections or face more protests. Imran Khan called off a planned demonstration after his supporters clashed with police outside Parliament. He warned they would return to the streets unless a vote was called within 6 days. Khan was toppled by a no-confidence vote, which he says was engineered by the United States.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi and the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands have committed to develop what they've called ironclad ties and deepen cooperation. It comes at the start of a 10-day tour of Pacific Island countries for Wang, amid reports China is seeking a regional deal covering policing, security and data. The Prime Minister thanks China for recent supplies to help fight the pandemic.
11 newborn babies have died in a hospital fire in Senegal. It's reported to have been caused by an electrical fault. 3 babies were saved from the fire. A similar incident happened last year, prompting calls for an inspection of all of Senegal's neonatal wards.
The U.S. state of Oklahoma now has the strictest abortion laws in America. A bill signed by the state governor makes it illegal to terminate a pregnancy at any stage. It also allows private citizens to sue anyone suspected of helping a woman have abortions. Oklahoma is one of a number of Republican-led states introducing legislation after reports that the Supreme Court is considering overturning the constitutional right to abortion.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the gunman at the school shooting posted his plans online before his killing spree. We're in the United States. Next.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. More details have emerged about the moments leading up to the killing of 19 children and 2 teachers at a school in the U.S. state of Texas.
Questions are being asked about the police response after the gunman entered the building. Associated Press correspondent Mark Stewart is in the city of Uvalde, where the attack happened. Mark, the governor of Texas says the gunman posted a warning online before the attack. What more can you tell us?
Indeed, good afternoon. The governor, Greg Abbott, here in Texas, said that approximately 30 minutes before the shootings, the gunman posted online or used some online communication to indicate that he was planning on doing some harm. It did not specifically mention Robb Elementary, where we are now, but it is indication that this is something that the gunman was speaking out about, at least on social media platforms. The governor is also telling us more about the gunman and his background. He said that he has no criminal past and there is nothing to indicate any type of mental health issues. But there is this lingering question that has caused so much heartbreak in this community, and that is the question of why, what prompted the shooting. And at this point, any motive, any kind of roadmap into that insight is just not coming clear right now.
Questions, too, are being asked about why the police took so long to enter the school.
Indeed, this is something that the Associated Press has been reporting on all morning long. We are hearing from people who were outside the school at the time of the shooting. They were urging police to go inside, but there are some questions as to why perhaps that response was a bit delayed. It's a question, it's an issue that is now being posed to leaders of the state here in Texas. In fact, the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety issued a statement saying that it was approximately anywhere from 40 minutes to about 1 hour as to when the gunman entered the school and then when he was shot by a tactical team. There's also a lot of question that is being discussed right now about whether or not the gunman met a security guard outside of the school. Still not clear, though, if any type of gunfire was exchanged. But this is a question, these questions, I should say, are something that state officials are being pressed on.
And there's a growing response, isn't there, to what's happened from the anti-gun lobby?
Well, this is a state where there is division on how firearms should be regulated, if at all. Democrats feel there should be limits as to whom can access a weapon and what type of weapon. But those on the other side feel that that's not the issue here. The issue is security, particularly at schools, and in many cases feel that these laws are moot. It is a debate that's taking place in Washington, but also here in Texas in the upcoming governor's race. Governor Greg Abbott had a news conference yesterday when one of his Democratic opponents, Beto O'Rourke, basically interrupted that press conference and saying more needs to be done. So this is a debate that is happening certainly on a broader scale in the U.S., but also here in the state of Texas.
Mark, thanks for that. Mark Stewart from the Associated Press in the United States. Stop leaving junk in space. That's the message from the European Space Agency, which wants all countries to stop sending anti-satellite weapons into space because they cause 90% of all space junk.
ASATs, as they're known, have successfully been used by China, India, Russia and the United States, who have all shot down their own satellites. Director General Joseph Aschbacher was talking to our correspondent Ryan Thompson at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
Space and economy are, of course, very tightly linked. Especially these days, we are saying we are having a new space race, and the space race is fired up by economy, by private capital, private people investing their own money into space, but also a lot of venture capital companies and funding agencies putting money into space.
Well, the list of major players that are in space is small, but of course quite powerful. I'm curious where in space science you see potential for cooperation between China and the European Space Agency.
Let me pick out one topic which I know is also extremely important for China and, of course, for Europe, which is climate change. I have recently been myself in China to discuss Earth observation and climate change. And I was reassured by our Chinese colleagues that climate change is on top of their agenda, and they really would like to help the world to establish a system of measurements where climate change is being addressed from space with data from Earth observation and also other means. And that's a global problem. It's not only for one country or one continent to solve, it needs everyone.
Over the past 2 years, we've seen space tourism really boom with projects from Elon Musk to Richard Branson. I'm curious, from your perspective, is this helping or hurting?
That's a very good question, actually, because you hear both sides. On one side, you hear people that say that this is firing up space and bringing new initiatives and new energy. On the other side, you hear people that this is harmful because it's harming the environment and is not the purpose of how we should do space research, because space, at least for the European Space Agency, is really focused on research, technology development and bringing space forward for the benefit of all its people. So yes, this is a question which is being debated. I think the market forces will decide. Take the example of NASA and SpaceX. I think a very good example of how a public agency, NASA, has been helping to create a very successful commercial company like SpaceX. And I think this is something that is happening in other places in the world as well, also in Europe.
What about space junk? Is there a reason that we should be worried here on planet Earth?
It's, of course, crucial for everyone to avoid collisions in space. But what, of course, is much more A problem is the ASAT tests, the anti-satellite tests that are happening, because they create the large amounts of debris. It's not necessarily the satellites themselves. Yes, of course, there we also have to look at and make sure that we are not completely clogging up our space up there. But it's really the ASAT tests that create 90% of all space debris. And yes, this is something where we have to work on. I really have to applaud the decision of the US to stop ASAT tests, and I really hope also that all the other nations are doing the same, because we need a clean environment up there in space in order to operate our satellites, which are essential for daily life for everyone.
China says it will plant 70 billion trees by 2030. The country's special envoy for climate change made the announcement at the World Economic Forum. CGTN spoke to Elizabeth Mrema, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity.
That is a clear demonstration of the connection between biodiversity loss and climate change. Because one will wonder, why should climate be concerned with trees? But you see, climate are understanding that solutions are actually in biodiversity. We need to plant trees. And delighted that China was able to announce 70 billion trees to be planted. It is trees, it is ecosystem, it is biodiversity, it is nature. But those solutions will actually have core benefits into climate. And again shows that connection, that the two needs to be dealt with in a whole, one can say whole of society, whole of government approach.
Now, fixing an astronaut's glove in space or improving recovery times for patients whose hands are paralyzed. Just some of the tasks made possible by new technology on show at the Microsoft Build conference in San Francisco. Our correspondent Mark New reports.
At the virtual Microsoft Build event, CEO Satya Nadella showed how the tech giant was shooting for the stars. NASA is using Microsoft machine learning systems to detect damage to an astronaut's glove. Back on Earth, Microsoft showed how it was working on using both hardware and software with Microsoft Teams to make meetings more natural and interactive.
We're dissolving the walls between digital and physical participation so people can present a PowerPoint together as though they were in the same location even when they're apart. Presence is the ultimate killer application. When you and I can remotely join the same meeting but feel like we are in the same room to create and collaborate together, that's finally within reach.
As Microsoft Build is a conference targeting developers, a key goal is to inspire programmers to continue building applications using Microsoft tools and services, and to make things easier for them to be more productive.
Microsoft announced the general release of GitHub Copilot, which uses AI to suggest code for programmers to complete their work. And through a new feature called Express Design, users can even upload a photo of a sketch to create an app. Microsoft Power Apps Vice President Ryan Cunningham says an AI model analyzes and recognizes patterns to help anyone build what they want.
It really enables a whole range of people who are not traditionally trained computer scientists to build applications and make their businesses more efficient. You can build it once and it will run anywhere with a web browser, desktop computer, or mobile. And there are actually native mobile apps that you can get on iOS and Android that will run those low-code Power Apps right inside of them.
I think that's a key part of Microsoft's strategy is they want to figure out a way to drive the creation of applications that can run anywhere on any device and really enable that whole software ecosystem. That's ultimately what Microsoft is a software ecosystem enabling company.
That ecosystem is expanding into a space called the industrial metaverse. Kawasaki Heavy Industries from Japan showed how it was using Microsoft Cloud to create a digital twin that simulates and predicts what happens in their factories.
The question is not just what we can build, but what the world needs us to build.
Building things the world needs is also an integral part of Microsoft's global student competition, Imagine Cup.
V-Bionic from Saudi Arabia!
V-Bionic from Saudi Arabia took home this year's cup by impressing judges with their affordable device that helps patients with hand paralysis recover 30% faster. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
Cars have changed the world, and Sir Norman Foster is one of the world's most influential architects. Bring the two together and you have one of the world's most fascinating exhibitions.
Sir Norman has designed famous buildings including Hong Kong International Airport and the Alibaba building in Shanghai. Now he's curated an exhibition at the Guggenheim inspired by one of his lifelong passions, the automobile. Our correspondent Rahul Pathak reports.
This is an exhibition for art lovers by an architect in a museum. Motion, Autos, Art and Architecture was curated by a man that has helped dynamically change the landscapes of some of the world's greatest cities. Norman Foster, whose works include Beijing Airport and the Reichstag building in Berlin, has taken time out to focus on another passion of his, the automobile. At a time when the car industry is changing from fossil fuel to greener energy, this exhibition provides a perfect snapshot of the past through nearly 40 vehicles, each representing the best in their genre. Leica Hyman-Waitola is the curator here at the Guggenheim in Bilbao and has worked extensively with the British award winner on his vision to create a unique perspective on the car.
And of course, having spent his career as an architect, he's spent a lot of time thinking about these relationships between different artistic disciplines, but also disciplines that cross into industrial design, also into urban planning, and the way that, you know, none of these sort of occur in a vacuum. There's always this relationship between art makers and industrial designers.
So what is utterly striking about this exhibition is how the different artistic worlds of art, design, sculpture and photography all come together so perfectly in this collection. Each car chosen for what it offered during its era: beauty, design, technical progress, or a glimpse into the future. Some of these beautiful-looking machines have been in private collections and others in public institutions a long way from here. Museum goers don't need to be fans of the automobile to appreciate the experience.
I really love the chronological order of it, starting from the horse-drawn carriages and then advancing into this really innovative and technology-driven future. Just cool to see how that progressed.
I just think the exhibition is excellent. They're focused on designs that no one has seen, because these have not been in the public eye.
This collection in many ways reflects the different eras greater Norman Foster has lived through. The architect brought huge innovation to some of the world's finest buildings, has given his perspective on an invention that has also completely changed the way we live our lives. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Bilbao.
The headlines again. America's top diplomat says China is the biggest challenge to the international order as he lays out Washington's policy towards Beijing.
Our other headlines: the African Union urges Russia to stop blockading Ukraine's ports, but Vladimir Putin blames the West for causing a global food crisis.
And easing the squeeze. Britain's finance minister will tax oil and gas companies to help families struggling to meet soaring energy bills.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.